Great, thanks. Okay, on to the next one. Just take your seats for the next session. We've had a lot this morning about technology. It's interesting. I was just reflecting just a minute ago. Interesting how if we were here sort of 3, 4, 5 years ago, the conversation was about technology transforming the marketplace. The conversations we've had so far today have been very much more around proof of a maturing marketplace. It's technology which is driving the back office, it's driving efficiencies. Yes, it's part of the business case, but it's part of the business case. It's not the business case. And clearly, the focus now is increasingly on identifying the gaps, bridging those gaps, using technology to fill those gaps, and driving efficiencies. Efficiencies, of course, also relies heavily on data. Data relies on privacy. And to that end, I'm going to introduce Ritesh Jain, who's going to talk today about open banking with two great speakers and the role of privacy in driving a more inclusive, easier, friction-free financial services marketplace. So please welcome Ritesh.
Hello. Hi, everyone. So my name is Dr. Ritesh Jain, and I come from the banking and payments. I led the future of banking for HSBC in the past, as well as the future of payments for Visa. I'm sure you have heard a lot about the open banking so far. And we have got a stellar panel over here, those who come from the industry. Michael Clark, who is from MasterCard and pretty well-known name and futurist, data futurist, and working on a very interesting book at the moment as well. Michael.
Good to see you.
Michael, I would like to introduce yourself as well, please.
Yeah, sure. It's lovely to be here. It's very surreal. So I've been involved in open banking from day zero. So back when I lived in the UK, working for a CMA9 bank, one day I got given a spec that basically said you need to comply. But luckily, I got to work on the compete side of the house. So we focused on delivering products off the back of open banking. Fast forward 3 years after that, I ended up helping to build what is MasterCard's first open banking product. So that accounts now for about 80% of the UK payment volume as it relates to open banking. As Ritesh said, I also now focus on what comes next, which is in essence the future open banking, which is really open data. So we have a lot of fun.
Thanks, Michael. And we have got Nihal. Nihal has got an exciting background. She comes from banking, digital transformation, and now open banking. Being into IFC and now with Ozone API. Nihal.
Thank you. Hello. Hi, thanks, Ritesh. As Ritesh said, today I represent Ozone API. I'm the GM for the region. Ozone API, just a quick background. We are the leading standard-based open finance platform, and we do two things. We help banks meet regulatory requirements around open banking, open finance, and monetize these open banking APIs in a standard compliant way. The other thing that we do, very interestingly, is we work with the central banks and the regulators to come up with the framework and the standards and provide the national infrastructure to make sure that all TPPs, all bank participants and consumers are compliant with an open banking framework. So the founders of Ozone have been the ones to draft and author the UK open banking framework. And we have been privileged to work with the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia to come up with the KSA framework and standards as well. Happy to be here. Thank you, Ritesh.
Thank you, Nihal. Please have a seat. Again, we have got two open banking experts over here. And yes, I'm coming from the open banking as well. So, Michael, and it's a question to both of you actually. What do you think about the data privacy in this whole gamut? Because with the open banking, what happened is the surface area has increased quite a lot. Now the data is across different third-party players. And that creates a significant challenge. So could you please just throw some light in terms of what's your view on the data privacy in the open banking and the significance of it?
So I think, the term data privacy, we were just talking, like, what does data privacy even mean? Because at the end of the day, open banking is about sharing your data, right? So by definition, you have to share to take part. So I think to me, data privacy also means something for the consumer. So it means, do I trust you to share my data with you? But equally, from the business side of the house, what are you doing to prevent data breaches? What are you doing? Because ultimately, good and bad, banks are being forced to share their data under this regulation, which means by definition, if it's my data as a consumer, I want to know that the TPP can store that in the right way, because ultimately they're carrying much more liability than people realize. So for me, data privacy means not just keep my data private, but also protect it from data breaches and unwanted bad actors. And I think that's some of the important points which sometimes people forget when it relates to open banking.
Nihal?
Thanks, Michael. You're absolutely right. If you think open banking, it's all based on data sharing, right? So where does privacy come in to this equation? And the fact is, what makes open banking slightly different than maybe card payments that are constantly also being hammered by fraudsters? Every day we hear about a card payment, about data being breached, because us as consumers, we've been sharing our card payment details with third-party providers all along. So open banking today, what this provides is actually a better way of being able to do payments from account to account, but based on trust. And that's at the heart of open banking. What we mean by trust here is that the regulator is coming in to put together a framework that regulates the relationship between a TPP, a bank, as a custodian of your data, and the end consumer who provides consent to specific third-party providers to access this data. So what open banking has actually done is it has allowed consumers to give back control to consumers, and I'm sure you've heard that all the time. But how is the data privacy part come to play? It's by being able to have a framework, a trust framework that overlooks who are the TPPs that are allowed to access this kind of data, and a whole compliance and conformance and certification that regulators have put in place to make sure that the laws around data privacy are being implemented. And we were also talking about every open banking framework is usually coupled with a data privacy law from the regulator. So they go hand by hand.
Very interesting, Nihal. And here I'm very cautious about the data privacy regulation across the different regions, right? As Michael said, day zero in the open banking. So do I come from the day zero in the open banking, right? We all come from the UK landscape where we started open banking. But how this whole data privacy is challenging the financial regulations and the transformation across the regions as well. Because if we talk about certain regions where the data privacy regulations are in place, but there are other regions where data privacy regulations do not exist. So could you please throw some light, Michael?
So I think the data privacy one, this is where it comes into play, right? Because I think in the early days, and you can speak to this, I'm sure you can, that it was a mind shift change for a bank, because now the customer was in control. So they had the choice who I give my data to and when, and almost for how long. And again, that would depend on what the bank would be allowed to do within the reams of regulation. And that varies per jurisdiction, by the way. So the big shift for a bank and what it means for them is, for the first time, they had to give up the crown jewels. And kicking and screaming, they had to do it. And interestingly, data privacy was probably one, other than interoperability, data privacy was one of the big foundations of open banking, because ultimately, as a consumer, you have to do it. So what did it mean for a bank? It involved incredible investment to be able to share data, but also embed data privacy rules to even make this even possible. You can't underestimate the role of data privacy and how all of this framework works.
Thanks, Michael. My question is more about the jurisdictions, right? Some of the jurisdictions that they have got data privacy regulations defined,
Yeah.
But in other jurisdictions where there's no data privacy regulation defined clearly, how do you think that is throwing a challenge for the open banking in those regions?
Good question. I think which one comes first. But in terms of, I think in jurisdictions where data privacy laws came out, it based the foundation for open banking to come through, right? I do not, as you see, do not think that a regulated open banking framework would be developed or launched to the market without a coupled data privacy law. In market-driven situations or market-driven countries, there could be an equivalent of a data privacy law, but again, there's a lot of education that needs to happen from a consumer perspective. Just like today you tell consumers, don't share your passwords with strangers, always have strong customer authentication, double authentication. All of those security measures have been taking precedence on the consumer level, and the same way it's going to happen if they start sharing their data with third-party providers as part of an open banking framework. The only difference there is here is that an open banking framework has an embedded, by design, security and risk security and risk profiles based on the Open ID Foundation, which is it's a working group of people that came up with what they call FAPI. And FAPI is a financial grade APIs that govern the relationship. It's based on authorization 2.0 and a strong customer authorization. So this allows for the relationship between all parties within a specific open banking framework to be in sync with what they would call privacy and control of data sharing back to the consumer.
So I'll just add to that as well. So on top of that, the markets that didn't have data privacy looked at other markets that did, and they took the best of breed from all of those markets. So Nigeria and other markets took elements of GDPR, some other African markets took elements of GDPR, and then others took bits from other pieces. So what you started to find with the countries that didn't have it, they took the best of everything around the open banking ecosystem. Because don't forget, all the countries that followed the UK had the benefit to watch and learn. So they could actually learn the good things and the bad things that the UK did and apply those into the standards. So what we're seeing with data privacy as it goes around the world is every market is learning and evolving how we think about data privacy.
Sounds good, Michael. I just want you to unfold a bit because it's a statement that we have been talking and I've been saying for years that open banking is the stepping stone, and you being a data futurist, I think that's the right place to talk. What do you really think that the way forward for open banking, as well as why it matters in terms of the data privacy and the security, right? Because from the future perspective, and not just the open banking.
Yeah.
So I just want you to throw some light on that, and I'll come back to you all.
So data, open banking is data at the end of the day. That's what you're moving around. When we used to talk about open banking in the beginning, it was never really open banking. It was the path to what it's going to be, which is open data. So you'll notice around the world, every market has either gone open banking, they've chosen to go either open finance, or they've gone the full 9 yards and they've gone to open data. Why is it so important? Is because open banking is the stepping stone to that place. It's the time to get it right. Because once you put those foundations in place, once you put consent in place, all of a sudden now those rails will become the means of how people will share data in the future. So if you're starting your journey on open banking, as you said, privacy by design has to be embedded because these are going to be the building blocks. Even now, right, in Europe, PSD3 is building on the foundations that open banking did in Europe. And they're already talking about identity wallets and all of those things, which means privacy has to be at the center of all of this.
Thank you, Michael. And Nihal, especially when we are talking about the different jurisdictions, as you know that people have learned and the jurisdictions have learned from each other. So what do you think that the different models of the open banking, because you are very well connected to SAMA, or you have been leading the open banking in Saudi Arabian market as well as the open banking in Australia or UK. So would you like to throw some light from the data privacy perspective in these jurisdictions and what they have considered?
From a data privacy perspective, I don't think that changes necessarily from one market to another. The foundation for data privacy in terms of the security layer, so OpenID Foundation, which is what I allude to in a bit, which is a security framework that governs open banking and open finance frameworks, that's a global standard, and the global standard that can be transportable from from all of the markets. So on the KSA standards, you have a FAPI compliance exercise where all of the banks have to comply to this FAPI exercise. You have the TPPs having to comply to the same. So everyone who's talking to each other as a consumer, you're pretty sure that if I am consenting my data to a third party that is part of this framework and has been certified, that I'm pretty sure that this party is following a security grade that is based on an OpenID foundation and a FAPI foundation. So in this case, and that's the case in Saudi Arabia, it's the case in the UK, and it's also the same case in CDR. That's a foundational level.
So that's about, sorry to interject, but that's more about the regulatory-driven open banking. Yeah. But let's come back to which is market-driven open banking. So just for the audience's information, like open banking is two-way. One, it is regulatory-driven, where it's in the markets where it is regulated, or where it is adopted, but it is not regulated. So basically, let's throw some light for the audience on the market-driven countries.
Scenarios. Yes. I think this is where I would like to shed a bit of light about the importance of standards, regardless of regulation. All right, so standards and regulation are not the same. So in some markets, there is a mandate, there's a regulatory mandate, and the regulatory mandate says that banks have to allow customers to consent data to third parties, right? And they don't necessarily tell them how to do it, right? They don't impose a specific standard to follow, or I mean, in a regulatory view, they impose a standard. But in a market-led view, there is no regulation, there is no mandate, and there is no standard to follow. And this is where I think it imposes a higher risk, because there is no framework to say who are the third parties that are accessing this data as a consumer. And so it becomes, this is where you start seeing phishing, skimming, all of the other ways of accessing data. Some of it is, again, probably, what's it called? Encrypted, right? And they say, yeah, it's all encrypted, we don't access, etc. But still, does the consumer know what this is? Is the consumer being very well informed that you are providing all of your bank account details, your accesses, that does not say which type of data am I actually allowing this TPP to access? In a regulatory framework, I'm actually telling the TPP only access my address, my KYC information, but do not access my transaction data. So are you able to choose which type of data to share with the TPP? This can be done in a regulatory framework, but in a market-based framework, it's probably umbrella access, umbrella consent, and you don't have enough leverage to choose which type of data to share with whom.
So I think there's another actor that we constantly are talking about the bank. But I think one of the big things, one of the drivers for open banking was innovation, to create a market that was open, to create more competition. So whilst the bank may have the best data privacy rules in the world, what about the TPP? Because now you're giving your data to somebody who may have organically built a product in a shed, right? And has just suddenly signed up to regulation, and now they can get all your data. So how do you know that your debit card that you're passing over an API to the bank is actually private and secure? So the data privacy rules are not just for the bank. They're actually for the people that the regulation was designed for in the first place, was to create an open market of competition in the neobanks that we all use today. So this is where it gets difficult, not just in different jurisdictions around what the bank has to do, but it's also controlling the ecosystem as a whole when it relates to data privacy.
Thanks, Michael. So what I'm alluding to over here, like in terms of the regulated market jurisdiction with the data privacy, open banking standards, all good, right? Let's talk about the technology, because everything is driven around the technology. So how technology can alleviate these pains and rectify the problem of the data privacy. Let's talk about the blockchain for that matter, or any other technology, how it can alleviate the pain for the consumers and give the peace of mind for the regulators as well as the providers.
So I think a lot of it is down to what you're doing in the data in transit as well. So how much masking can you do as an organization to remove financial information that's passing? And also what role are you playing, right? So we haven't talked about processors and controllers and what role you're going to play in open banking, for example. So when I was building the product in the company I was in, we chose to be a processor. So we never touched the data. We were just a pass-through and eventually got to the bank on the other side. But I'll give you an example of differences of jurisdictions as well when it relates to technology. When open banking was first introduced in the UK, the PAN number was never masked. So there was no guarantee in a reference field that the customer would put their PAN number in to remind themselves they paid their credit card bill. It was up to the third party or the bank to make sure that was masked. Whereas other markets now have done that by design, from a design process. So there are different technologies that you can use within a bank to mask data, obfuscate it, remove information that's not required, even to the point of throttling data. So what I mean by that is creating pagination. So limiting the amount of data that you would give to a third party, for example, which would stop someone a data breach. So I'm not going to allow you to send 100,000 transactions of someone's account. I'm going to give you only 3 months, or I'm only going to give you 2 months, whatever the regulation says. So there are different technologies and different things that can be done on the bank side to protect the customer's data. And obviously blockchain and other things are much more forward-looking. I think there's foundational technologies which you can talk to from an ozone point of view that are massively important. I would forget blockchain for now. Let's just get the foundations right.
Right, exactly. Yeah. That's
No, please go ahead.
Yes, and that's exactly what we do at Ozone. So we a lot of times we've been. We were at a point at Ozone of whether we should focus on TPPs or on the bank side, and there are a number of aggregators in the market that focus on TPPs. But these TPPs will need an API, an external compliant standard API to connect to from a bank side, right? And we as Ozone focused on enabling the banks to turn their internal APIs into external compliant standard APIs for TPPs to connect to. And these are based on global standards. So there are 7 global standards for open banking in the world, which we support in our platform. And we help take the journey from a developer sandbox perspective, where TPPs are being automatically onboarded onto the platform. The TPPs are allowed to access specific data that's being consented by the customer, and not all the customer information, only specific ones based on the standard and the framework that they are part of. And you've got the authorization, the consent management, the billing, and the invoicing all happening at the same place. Even the regulatory reporting happening in the same space. And so, to your point, Michael, how do we enable the banks? Everybody's been focusing on how we enable TPPs to access information, but how can we enable the banks to allow TPPs to access the information in a standard way, in a secure way, because we're talking about security, and in a way that the banks are able to monetize this relationship as well. And that's the most important part.
Nihal, I like that, especially because when it comes down to the payments network globally, and the largest payment network, by the way, and whether it's about the open banking, the challenge comes down that how the financial institution is going to monetize, because ultimately they felt initially they are only giving away the customers, right? So Michael, coming back to you.
Yeah.
What do you think that how banks can monetize the open banking and typical monetization model?
So I was in this position 10 years ago, where we had to convince a bank, a very old bank, not to just tick the comply box, because you would be disintermediated. So the goal was, how do you compete in open banking? The first thing we did was consume our own APIs. So we set ourselves up as a TPP, as a bank, which all banks started to do in the original days of the CMA9, and we consumed our own APIs. The second thing is, when it comes to premium APIs, is almost, you're stuck with the regulation, so you can't not monetize that. You've got to give it away, and that's just a fact. What you can do is either add additional data points onto those APIs or create premium new ones. Now, in the UK, Barclays were one of the first to do it, and many of others followed. Yeah? So in essence, then you can do maybe APIs for cards, maybe faster onboarding, all of that sort of good stuff. And another way the bank makes money is not on the bottom line. They can make money on the top line. Because everybody talks about open banking for building products. You can use open banking to accelerate your onboarding process. You can actually get faster onboarding to increase your merchants because now I have extra data that I never had before. I may even be able to change my risk tolerances as a bank. So now I'm not increasing revenue, but I'm reducing cost. And eventually, by able to onboard many merchants faster, I can actually make more money. So when I speak to customers around the world about open banking and monetizing it, it doesn't always have to start with a product. And equally, premium APIs have to start with one single thing. What problem am I solving? Because I'll tell you now, one of the biggest problems with open banking, it created a culture of a solution looking for a problem in a business. But actually, open banking is the enabler to your products and services, and that's where the bank started to shift the mindset of looking at open banking as not just a big bucket of regulation, it's an enabler to how you would deliver better analytics, better premium API products, and so on. But
Thanks,
just to add one more thing, it takes an operating model change.
Yeah.
Right? So most banks in the UK organize themselves eventually around compete, comply, and innovate. Because then you had a section of the bank that would never be interrupted because they needed to focus on compliance. Then there was another part of the bank that focused on compete. So I know there's conversations about technology, but there is an entire operating model change that has to take inside a bank to be able to transition to using open banking.
That's good. Sorry, I'm pivoting a bit over here because we are talking about the open banking and data privacy, but it's a very interesting conversation because globally we are looking into empowering SMEs, right? Not only the customer, but empowering SMEs, as well as we are looking into the financial inclusion as well. So again, coming back to you, Nihal, coming from your another hat, which is IFCs, I would really like to understand your view that how open banking has a challenge with respect to the data privacy in SMEs.
I'll tackle the SMEs, how open banking can help support the SMEs in specific, but then I think the data privacy piece doesn't change across whether from SMEs or retail specifically. But in terms of, I'd like to allude to the difference between, and I think the learnings that we got out of the UK is that the exercise in the UK was at the beginning purely compliance-based, and this gave the world the notion that open banking is a pain, and as a bank you don't really get anything out of it, except that I have to check the box of compliance, and we're not sure when or how we're going to be making money. But I think taking the learning of that and fast forward 5 years later in Saudi Arabia, they started off by assessing the use case, right? Mm-hmm. It's a use case first approach. What are the use cases that will drive open banking in the economy, so for innovation purposes? And what are the consumers or SMEs looking to have? What are the market participants, TPPs? Who are the TPPs that I have in the market that will engage with these APIs? And what will the banks make out of it? How can the banks monetize? So they had a vision for banks to monetize the open banking based on premium versus mandated APIs. So in Saudi Arabia, for example, we've seen one of the major use cases, and it's the first open banking embedded, I call it open banking embedded service request, which is the idea of being able to apply for an LG through a third party, a certified third party application. So as an SME, I could apply for an LG, not from the bank directly, but from a certified third-party provider. And that is an embedded service request that's the first that we've seen around the region so far. So that's just one use case, and I think there will be many others that are coming in hopefully in the next wave in Saudi Arabia.
Thanks, Nihal. Michael, a very interesting part that we see in the innovation in the financial services space, needless to say, it's a day in and day out. And we have lived that life, right? I've gone gray. I didn't have gray hair before joining the bank. So where the innovation has thrown a spanner or created a challenge from a data privacy perspective, can you just give some examples about it?
So the big one in the UK was the original promise of open banking was you wouldn't no longer need any mortgage proofs anymore, right? So I could open a loan with just my open banking data. But that became a problem because I didn't have the account number. So I didn't even know who it was. So all of a sudden you had boards getting excited because all of a sudden, oh my God, I can reduce my paperwork, I can reduce my conversation that takes 3 hours now down to a click of a button, and I've got straight through processing. But that threw up so many anomalies because first of all, you didn't know who it was. It could be anybody opening another account on your behalf. And equally then, what happens to all the other processes in the business at the same time? So the more you try to innovate with open banking in its early days, the more brick walls you ran into, right? Because you ran into the security problem, you ran into the fact that the specs weren't complete enough because they didn't have enough data. So, and also then as it evolved, there's instances in the UK with, customers I've worked with who are trying to launch, new credit decisioning processes and so on. So again, the accuracy of the data around privacy becomes even more important. So depending on the jurisdiction, innovation can also be a blocker because of the strictness of the open banking regulation. So there are so many examples where we've hit walls because either spec's not broad enough or it's actually caused issues in the privacy because people have tried things that it doesn't fit.
Actually,
Thanks,
I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
If
No, I think it
anything,
is.
it proves that open banking is very keen on data privacy, to the fact that it sometimes hinders innovation. So I'm not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but from a data privacy perspective, the framework and the rules and the business rules and the standards are there to ensure security. Obviously, there's always always a spectrum between security, risk, and innovation, but it should always evolve to allow for innovation to take precedence under a specific security framework.
Because we don't want it to get to the point where we see HIPAA in the US, where healthcare innovation becomes incredibly complex because of how different the regulation is per country and per state. And almost you get, as a patient, you get impacted because of the fact people won't innovate and they're afraid to, right? What we don't want to do is, as open banking rolls out, we implement privacy by design, but we allow it to be flexible enough so innovation can continue and evolve, but in a controlled way.
So basically what I'm gathering is definitely disruptive innovation is not the only way forward, right? You could innovate in a simpler way by solving the real problems. It doesn't really need to go disruptive. On that note, when I came back to SME, especially around the open banking, my challenge with the SMEs space, and let's talk about the mom and pop shops. Let's talk about somebody selling nuts on the side of the street, right? How, if we want to bring them into the ecosystem, right? Because the surface area has grown significantly, what are the challenges that we will face, not from the data privacy in the open banking, again, not from the data privacy in open banking, but overall, financial institution, how they can bring them on board and create that ecosystem for them. Because open banking is not everywhere. So
No, it's not.
what I meant is simple. Do you have an alternate to open banking?
I think
You do, but it was mandated out within the UK, right? So think about the US. The US has had open banking before it was called open banking, right? But they were using screen scraping and various other mechanisms. The reason open banking came in was to eradicate those alternative mechanisms because most customers, believe it or not, were breaching their T's and C's by even sharing their data in those means. So I don't think there's an alternative. I won't think that what there is better education and making it easier for an SME to access those services. Because there's huge benefits, right? There's cash liquidity forecasting. There's loads of things that a bank can give a small to medium business. This conversation goes much deeper because it's really about what the bank does to grow a customer from the mom and pop to maybe a corporate. That's a bigger conversation. But the bank needs to be able to offer those facilities in a way that they can access them easily, and it probably won't be through a bank. It probably will be, through a third party maybe that's offering it, right? It's probably not going to be the bank. It's probably going to be John Smith Limited, who's offering an SME aggregation platform for SMEs who are that sort of size customer, right? They've got to make it easier for those TPPs to offer that solution to the SME, or if the SME is playing the TPP, of course.
Thanks, Michael. Very interesting conversation because you were leading the open banking in the region as well. How is the response from the regulators when it comes down to the variety of aspects, and especially on the data privacy?
Sorry, can you repeat that again?
What is the response from regulator and how they look into open banking from the data privacy perspective, and what they have done differently to make it easier for financial institutions as well as customers to adopt it?
If we're talking about the region, and the region in specific, or the region specific, we find, you've got, obviously, that Bahrain have mandated it long before, like 2018, 19, if I remember correctly. They followed the UK standards, so they did not launch or develop their own Bahraini framework or standards. They implemented the UK standards and mandated banks to open up their APIs. It wasn't prescriptive enough, perhaps, that it did not mandate a specific type of user experience. It wasn't made for app to app, for example, and they've left the banks to expose the APIs in the manner that they felt best for them. So the uptake, and you wanted to discuss the uptake, right? About open banking. So that was one of the reasons, perhaps, that we did not see massive uptake in the numbers when it comes to number of consents and open banking payments that were happening in Bahrain, and that could be one of the reasons of perhaps the user experience was not prescriptive enough. But I think in Saudi Arabia, and I don't think this is the nature of open banking. With every new country that's implementing open banking, they're taking the learnings of the country before that. So there's always the learning to build on. It almost kind of feels like all of the new standards that are coming up is going to be a mix of all of the 7 global standards that are around today. And it just keeps getting better.
Thank you, Nihal. I totally agree. And I just want to add to your point, how do you make it easier for banks? So I think there's something you can't get away from, is that there are standard building blocks for open banking that you need at infrastructure level regardless, right? So all the specs tell you what needs to be done. For the bank, in most cases, it's not easy. Why? Because they're still battling with legacy technology, and they may not even have some of the capabilities that open banking is demanding. So some banks, for example, in the UK had consent mechanisms, they had API gateways, they had all of that stuff, right? And some banks were in the dark ages. It took them 2 to 3 years to catch up, and they almost missed the deadline and got extensions. So as this rolls out across the world, the functional specs remain the same, but you need to think that most banks now are going through a digital transformation to even comply with open banking, which is no mean feat to do.
Yeah.
Thank you. Nihal, that's what I was alluding to earlier, that the data privacy regulations, international standards are fine, but even when we come down to the personal identifiable information, PII and non-PII, that varies as per the jurisdictions.
Yep.
So you answered it pretty beautifully. Thank you. So now we are coming towards the end as well, Michael and Nihal. So what do you think is the way forward for the open banking, especially from the data privacy perspective and as well as in general for the global markets?
So I think So I've always been optimistic and excited by open banking because of where it goes. So I think eventually we'll get to a place where there'll be a market that does it right, which takes all of the standards and we go, that's it. And then eventually that will be the common model that will be adopted globally. That's my hope in terms of this market maybe the one that will drive that standardization that becomes because if you think, I'm working with banks in New Zealand, Australia, and they're all looking here now to say, well, what are they doing here? So why is this important is because ultimately the consent rails for open banking will be the means for how we'll share data. So as this proliferates around the world, as each market gets closer to what is, that's it, you'll see a lot of markets then revisiting what they did based on other markets, and then you'll see other markets who are new following that standard. So we will get to a place eventually where the circle will complete. And then the next question is what comes next?
Thank you, Nihal.
Yeah, I think to your point, I think it's always going to get, the learning is going to get better. It's going to be faster. So it kind of feels like every new country that's launching its open banking standards, it's again building on what others have done. We, as for example, as Ozone API, our platform supports all 7 standards, global standards. We have over 500 financial grade APIs that are open banking compliant based, which is transportable from one market to another. So it kind of feels like if we're going to a central bank today and they want to launch their standard and framework tomorrow, it kind of becomes out of the box. We could bring in the UK standard, the KSA standards, the Berlin Group standards, FDX, CDR, you name it. So the idea here, what I'm hoping for the future is that we see more countries come on board, because the train has, the ship has sailed, and I think it kind of becomes faster and easier and quicker to launch an open banking framework and standard in markets across the globe, just by design, because now we've seen the use cases, we've seen the numbers, we've seen what worked, and there are trust frameworks that can be embedded very, very quickly.
Thank you, Nihal. That's very enlightening. Michael and Nihal, thank you very much. Michael, before you go, I would really like to throw some light on the book that you're writing at the moment. If you can, please.
Yeah, sure. So the book itself is aimed at people like you in this room and governments, because what's happening as a consequence of open banking as we start to get open data is people will own their own data. What does that mean? Is data is becoming a currency and an asset. So the whole book is going to talk about how data becomes a utility, an asset, ultimately is going to power what we know to be the metaverse and new realities, and ultimately become the basis of a smart economy. So that comes out in the spring. I'm really pleased that I get people like Brett King to write the last chapter on smart economies. I've got interviews with people building the digital pound in London, where we talk about the collateralization of data and new clearing houses that are going to move data around, ultimately giving governments and businesses the advice and guidance they need to embed data privacy, but also then create a market where people will own their own data. And what does that mean for a business as we go forward?
Thank you, Michael. So that definitely entails that we are becoming the data,
Yeah.
and the privacy prevails, right? So thank you very much,
Thank you.
Nihal and Michael. Thank you.
Thank you,
you.
Ritesh. Thank you, Michael.
Well done, guys. Thank you very much. I think we're going to get a photo of the group, so let's do that for you.